The idea that Iran's supreme leader could one day be forced to flee his own country is no longer limited to fringe speculation or dramatic headlines. It has entered mainstream political discussion because Iran today is facing a convergence of crises unlike anything it has experienced since the 1979 revolution. Economic collapse, internal dissent, international isolation, and growing fractures within the ruling elite have created an atmosphere of uncertainty at the very top of the Islamic Republic. While no official confirmation exists that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is preparing to leave Iran, the mere circulation of such reports reveals how fragile the system has become. For decades, the Iranian regime has survived by projecting strength, religious legitimacy, and absolute control. The supreme leader has been presented as an untouchable figure, protected by ideology, security forces, and a carefully crafted image of divine authority. However, the reality on the ground increasingly contradicts that image. Iran's economy has been crushed by years of sanctions, corruption, and mismanagement. Inflation has eroded purchasing power, unemployment has spread among the youth, and the national currency has lost much of its value. For ordinary Iranians, survival has become a daily struggle, and patience with the ruling system is wearing thin. Economic collapse is not just a social issue. It is a political time bomb. The Iranian regime relies heavily on financial resources to maintain loyalty within its security apparatus, including the Revolutionary Guards and intelligence agencies. When the state can no longer reliably pay salaries, fund foreign militias, or subsidize basic goods, cracks begin to appear. History shows that authoritarian regimes rarely fall because of foreign pressure alone. They collapse when they lose the ability to control their own population and reward their own enforcers. Iran appears dangerously close to that point. Public anger has repeatedly exploded into nationwide protests over the past few years. These protests are no longer limited to specific cities or social groups. They include students, workers, women, ethnic minorities, and even segments of the religious population. What makes these uprisings particularly alarming for the regime is their openly political nature. Protesters are no longer just demanding economic relief. They are questioning the legitimacy of the supreme leader himself. Chants against Khamenei represent a psychological breaking point, as fear of the system's highest authority begins to fade. At the same time, Iran's international position has weakened significantly. Once able to balance between global powers, Tehran is now heavily dependent on a small group of allies. Russia has emerged as one of Iran's most important strategic partners, especially after Iran became increasingly isolated from the West. Military cooperation, energy deals, and shared opposition to Western influence have brought Tehran and Moscow closer than ever. This relationship has fueled speculation that Russia could serve as a potential safe haven if Iran's leadership faces an existential threat at home. The notion of a contingency escape plan is not unusual in authoritarian systems. Leaders who publicly claim absolute confidence often privately prepare for worst-case scenarios. Reports suggesting that Khamenei may have an evacuation plan involving Russia do not necessarily mean he intends to use it soon. Instead, they highlight a growing awareness within Iran's leadership that total control can no longer be taken for granted. The very existence of such planning signals fear, not strength. Another critical factor is the issue of succession. Ayatollah Khamenei is aging, and uncertainty about who will replace him has intensified power struggles within the regime. Rival factions within the Revolutionary Guards, clerical establishment, and political elite are positioning themselves for a post-Khamenei Iran. This internal competition weakens cohesion and increases the risk of sudden instability. If protests escalate during a succession crisis, the system could face a level of chaos it is ill-equipped to manage. Russia's role in this scenario is both strategic and symbolic. Moscow has a long history of offering protection to embattled leaders who serve its geopolitical interests. From former Soviet allies to Middle Eastern strongmen, Russia has positioned itself as a last refuge when Western doors are closed. For Iran's supreme leader, Russia represents not only physical safety, but also political continuity. A place where he could maintain influence and avoid international prosecution or humiliation. However, fleeing the country would be a catastrophic admission of failure for the Islamic Republic. The regime's legitimacy is built on resistance, sacrifice, and the idea that its leaders are divinely guided and inseparable from the Iranian nation. If the supreme leader were to leave, even temporarily, it would shatter this narrative. Such a move could trigger rapid collapse, as security forces and loyalists question why they should continue defending a system whose highest authority has abandoned it. This is why any potential escape would likely be framed as a temporary or strategic relocation rather than a permanent flight. The regime would attempt to maintain control through deputies and emergency structures, at least initially. Yet, history suggests that once a leader leaves under pressure, return becomes increasingly unlikely. Power vacuums invite challengers, and fear spreads quickly through institutions built on obedience rather than genuine loyalty. As the specter of instability continues to loom over Iran, the dynamics within the country's power structures are becoming increasingly complex and unpredictable. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, while still the ultimate authority on paper, is facing pressures that were unimaginable even a decade ago. The possibility of fleeing to Russia, discussed in intelligence and media reports, underscores the precarious balance the regime is struggling to maintain. It is not merely a question of personal safety for Khamenei, but a reflection of the fragility of a system that has long relied on fear, ideology, and centralized control to sustain itself. The first and most immediate challenge confronting the regime is widespread civil unrest. From urban centers to smaller towns, Iranian citizens have taken to the streets repeatedly, demonstrating against economic hardship, corruption, and political repression. The protests are remarkable not just for their frequency, but for their scale and intensity. Unlike earlier demonstrations, which were often localized and sporadic, these recent movements are nationwide and increasingly coordinated, aided in part by social media and encrypted messaging platforms. The government's attempts to suppress these protests with force have yielded only limited success, further exposing the limits of its control over the population. Economic collapse has been both a catalyst and a consequence of these uprisings. Inflation has surged to levels that make everyday necessities unattainable for large segments of society. Unemployment, particularly among the youth, has become endemic, leading to a sense of hopelessness and disenchantment. Industries once thought resilient, such as oil and gas, are struggling under the combined weight of international sanctions and internal mismanagement. For a regime whose legitimacy has long been tied to its ability to provide for its people, or at least maintain an illusion of economic competence, the failure to deliver basic stability is deeply destabilizing. Within this context, the loyalty of the Revolutionary Guards and other security apparatuses is a critical concern. Historically, the regime has relied heavily on these forces to maintain control and suppress dissent. However, as financial resources dwindle, maintaining the loyalty of these elite units becomes increasingly difficult. Salaries may be delayed, resources for operations limited, and internal morale eroded. In authoritarian systems, once the enforcers begin to doubt the sustainability of the leadership, the risk of defection or passive resistance rises dramatically. Khamenei's alleged contingency plan to escape to Russia may, therefore, be as much about ensuring the regime's survival as it is about personal safety. The potential flight of a supreme leader to a foreign nation is an unprecedented scenario for Iran, but it is not without precedent in modern geopolitics. Leaders in similarly precarious positions have historically sought refuge in allied nations when faced with existential threats at home. Russia, in particular, has served as a strategic safe haven in numerous cases, leveraging its geopolitical influence to protect leaders aligned with its interests. For Iran, Russia represents not only a secure location, but a continuation of strategic partnership, especially in military and political spheres. The possibility of relocation to Moscow reflects the interdependence of the two countries in the face of Western sanctions and regional tensions. The internal political landscape of Iran is also undergoing significant transformations. The question of succession has long been a point of tension within the clerical establishment. As Khamenei ages factions within the religious hierarchy, the Revolutionary Guards and political elites are positioning themselves to influence the future leadership of the country. These rivalries create a volatile environment, as competing interests can undermine unity and increase the risk of internal conflict. The supreme leader's consideration of a temporary relocation may also be a strategic move to buy time while navigating these factional dynamics, preserving options for a controlled transition rather than leaving the country in chaos. Internationally, Iran's position has grown increasingly isolated. Decades of strained relations with Western powers, compounded by nuclear sanctions and economic embargoes, have left the country with few reliable allies. Russia, however, has emerged as a key partner, offering both political support and strategic military cooperation. This alliance provides Iran with a degree of leverage, yet it also highlights Tehran's vulnerability. Dependence on a single major ally exposes the regime to the whims of external actors, making the potential flight of the supreme leader not just a domestic issue, but a geopolitical one as well. The politic implications of such a flight are profound. Khamenei's legitimacy is rooted in a combination of religious authority and political dominance. Leaving Iran, even temporarily, would challenge the foundational narrative of the Islamic Republic, that its leaders are inseparable from the nation, divinely guided and resilient against both internal and external threats. The act of fleeing, or even the preparation to flee, signals vulnerability and could embolden opposition forces, encourage further defections, and erode the confidence of loyalists. The psychological impact of such an event may be as significant as any physical threat to the regime. In anticipation of potential unrest, the regime has likely considered various contingency measures. These might include strengthening the security presence around key institutions, attempting to control the narrative through state media, preparing loyalists for a rapid consolidation of power in Khamenei's absence. However, historical evidence suggests that authoritarian systems are rarely capable of fully controlling the fallout from a leader's departure under duress. Once the perception of instability takes hold, momentum can quickly shift to opposition movements, leading to unpredictable outcomes. It is also important to recognize the human element in this scenario. For Khamenei and those close to him, considerations of personal safety, family security, and political legacy are intertwined. The potential decision to relocate to Russia is not made in isolation, but is influenced by assessments of threats, loyalty of allies, and the ability to maintain authority from abroad. Leaders in such precarious positions must weigh the consequences of action versus inaction, knowing that both paths carry significant risks. Finally, the broader implications for the region cannot be overstated. Iran's domestic instability, potential leadership, relocation, and economic crises have ripple effects across the Middle East. Neighboring countries, regional powers, and global actors are closely monitoring developments, each calculating the potential outcomes for security, energy markets, and diplomatic alignments. A weakened Iran could alter the balance of power, influence ongoing conflicts, and reshape alliances in unpredictable ways. The potential flight of Iran's supreme leader to Russia, while still speculative, sheds light on the intricate and fragile nature of Iran's political and social systems. The scenario illuminates not only the pressures on Khamenei personally, but also the deep structural weaknesses within the Islamic Republic. Over the past decade, Iran has faced mounting internal and external challenges, from economic collapse and widespread protests to international sanctions and shifting alliances, all of which have contributed to the perception that the regime is nearing a breaking point. Understanding this context is critical for comprehending why the possibility of the supreme leader seeking refuge abroad has become a serious topic of discussion among analysts and intelligence sources. At the heart of Iran's instability lies its economy. Once the backbone of the regime's legitimacy, the economy is now a source of widespread dissatisfaction and unrest. Years of sanctions, coupled with internal corruption and mismanagement, have crippled key sectors such as oil production, manufacturing, and trade. Inflation has soared to unprecedented levels, and basic necessities like food, fuel, and healthcare have become increasingly scarce for ordinary citizens. The middle class, which traditionally served as a stabilizing force, is shrinking, while poverty and unemployment continue to rise. The erosion of economic stability undermines the government's ability to maintain control, as financial hardship often translates into political anger and organized opposition. Protests across the country have grown not only in size, but also in intensity and coordination. Social media and encrypted messaging platforms have enabled activists to organize quickly and bypass state censorship, creating a decentralized network of resistance that is difficult for the government to suppress. What began as sporadic demonstrations have evolved into sustained movements, challenging the authority of the supreme leader and the ruling elite. Unlike previous waves of unrest, these protests are not limited to specific groups or regions. They encompass students, workers, women, and ethnic minorities alike. The collective demand now extends beyond economic relief to questions of governance, freedom, and legitimacy, striking at the very foundations of the Islamic Republic. The regime's reliance on the Revolutionary Guards and other security forces to maintain power is being tested like never before. These forces, historically loyal and disciplined, are experiencing strains as financial resources dwindle and morale declines, with economic pressures affecting the ability to pay salaries and fund operations. The loyalty of these elite units is increasingly uncertain. Authoritarian systems, when security forces begin to question the sustainability of their leadership, the risk of defection, insubordination, or passive resistance rises dramatically. The potential for internal fractures within these forces amplifies the instability and could accelerate the collapse of the regime in the event of a leadership vacuum. Khamenei's rumored contingency plan to escape to Russia should be understood in this context. It is not simply about personal safety. It represents a calculated measure to preserve the continuity of leadership and protect the regime from total collapse. By securing a safe location abroad, the supreme leader could maintain influence over loyalists, coordinate a response to crises, and avoid being forced into decisions under extreme duress. This plan underscores the degree to which Iran's leadership is aware of its vulnerabilities and is preparing for scenarios that could dramatically alter the balance of power within the country. Russia's role in this potential scenario is multifaceted. Beyond providing a secure location, Russia serves as a strategic ally that shares political and military objectives with Iran. The two countries have collaborated extensively on issues ranging from regional conflicts to economic sanctions, evasion. For the supreme leader, Russia offers not just safety, but a platform from which to maintain strategic influence, safeguard key alliances, and potentially return to Iran under more favorable circumstances. This reliance, however, also highlights Iran's geopolitical vulnerability. Dependence on a single powerful ally limits autonomy and exposes the regime to external pressures and negotiations. The symbolic ramifications of a leader fleeing the country are profound. Khamenei's authority is deeply intertwined with the ideological and religious foundations of the Islamic Republic. Leaving Iran would challenge the narrative that the supreme leader is inseparable from the nation and divinely guided, potentially eroding the psychological and moral authority that underpins the regime. It could embolden opposition groups, inspire further protests, and create uncertainty within the ranks of loyalists. Even the perception of potential flight can destabilize the system. Fear and doubt spread more quickly than any physical rebellion. Succession concerns further complicate the picture. Khamenei's aging leadership has long been a source of uncertainty, with various factions within the clerical establishment and political elite jockeying for influence. This internal competition weakens cohesion and increases the risk of instability in moments of crisis. A contingency plan to relocate to Russia may serve as a strategic pause, allowing time to navigate these internal dynamics without the added pressure of immediate threats or public scrutiny. However, even with careful planning, the departure of a supreme leader under duress can accelerate succession struggles and heighten the risk of factional conflict. Internationally, the prospect of Khamenei fleeing Iran carries significant consequences. The Middle East is already a volatile region, and any sign of instability within Iran could shift alliances, embolden adversaries, and trigger a re-evaluation of strategic priorities by global powers. Neighboring countries, aware of Iran's influence and its role in regional conflicts, would closely monitor developments, adjusting their security and diplomatic strategies accordingly. The potential relocation of the supreme leader to Russia adds another layer of complexity, intertwining domestic Iranian instability with broader geopolitical considerations, particularly regarding U.S.-Russia relations and the balance of power in the Middle East. The human element in this scenario cannot be overlooked. Leaders in precarious positions must weigh personal safety, family security, and political legacy when considering extreme measures like fleeing their country. For Khamenei, such a decision would be fraught with both risk and uncertainty, as leaving Iran could undermine the very authority he has spent decades consolidating. Yet remaining in a country on the brink of civil unrest also carries life-threatening dangers and the possibility of total political defeat. These considerations highlight the immense pressure facing the supreme leader and the high-stakes nature of decision-making in the current climate. Even if Khamenei never relocates, the mere discussion of such a contingency has already altered perceptions. Within Iran, awareness of potential escape plans may influence the behavior of elites, security forces, and the public, creating an atmosphere of suspicion, caution, and uncertainty. Internationally, signals to allies and adversaries alike that the regime may not be as stable or invulnerable as it has long projected. These shifts in perception are significant, as in authoritarian regimes, fear, confidence, and legitimacy are often as decisive as military or economic power in maintaining control. Ultimately, the scenario of the supreme leader fleeing to Russia serves as a prism through which to examine the multiple crises facing Iran: economic failure, civil unrest, elite factionalism, succession uncertainty, and international isolation converge to create a precarious environment in which even the highest authority is not immune to threats. Whether or not the contingency plan is ever enacted, its existence underscores the fragility of the Islamic Republic and the growing recognition within its leadership that the old paradigms of absolute control may no longer be sufficient. As Iran continues to navigate its most turbulent period in decades, the possibility of a supreme leader seeking refuge abroad remains both a symbol of potential collapse and a strategic contingency plan. The scenario underscores how deeply intertwined domestic unrest, economic deterioration, geopolitical dynamics have become in determining the stability of the Islamic Republic. While much of the discussion surrounding this topic is speculative, it is rooted in observable realities. Widespread protests, factional rivalries, financial crises, and shifting international alliances all contribute to a climate where even the highest authority in the country is not immune to existential threats. At the core of this situation is the ongoing economic crisis. Iran's financial system, long propped up by oil revenues and state-controlled industries, struggling under international sanctions, mismanagement, and internal corruption. Inflation has reached levels that threaten the livelihoods of millions, while unemployment continues to rise, particularly among the younger population, to a society that is increasingly frustrated by scarcity and inequality. Economic distress fuels political unrest and erodes the legitimacy of the ruling regime. The inability of the government to provide basic stability undermines the psychological contract between leaders and citizens, making even the strongest authoritarian structures vulnerable to collapse. Civil unrest across the country is another critical factor. From Tehran to smaller provincial cities, demonstrations have become increasingly organized and widespread. Unlike previous protests, these movements are no longer sporadic or isolated. Instead, they are coordinated, persistent, and deeply rooted in social grievances. Citizens are openly challenging the authority of the supreme leader, demanding reforms and accountability. This social pressure is compounded by modern communication tools that enable coordination and information dissemination, making it more difficult for the regime to suppress dissent through conventional means. The growing boldness of protesters reflects a critical tipping point where fear of the system is no longer sufficient to maintain obedience within the corridors of power. Tensions are also mounting. The Revolutionary Guards and other security institutions, long considered the backbone of regime stability, are showing signs of strain. Reduced resources, delayed salaries, and internal discontent have eroded the once monolithic loyalty these forces provided. In authoritarian regimes, the support of such institutions is crucial. If they begin to waver, even subtly, it can trigger a domino effect that weakens the leadership further. Reports of contingency plans for evacuation reflect a calculated recognition by the supreme leader and his inner circle that their hold on power may not be guaranteed, highlighting the precarious nature of their authority. The potential role of Russia in this scenario adds another dimension to the crisis. Russia is positioned as a reliable strategic partner, capable of providing both physical security and political leverage. The geopolitical relationship between Iran and Russia, strengthened by mutual interests in energy, military cooperation, and opposition to Western influence, makes Moscow a logical choice for a contingency safe haven. For the supreme leader, Russia represents a location where he can maintain influence, coordinate with loyalists, and potentially plan a return under more favorable conditions. However, this dependence on a foreign power also reveals the vulnerabilities inherent in Iran's international position. Reliance on a single powerful ally limits autonomy and creates new risks if geopolitical priorities shift. The symbolic consequences of a potential flight are profound. Khamenei's authority is fundamentally tied to the perception of invulnerability, religious legitimacy, and moral authority. Leaving Iran would challenge these narratives, potentially undermining confidence within both the political elite and the general population. Even the suggestion of such a move can embolden opposition groups and create uncertainty among loyalists, weakening the psychological and political foundations of the regime. In many ways, the perception of vulnerability can be as destabilizing as actual departure, accelerating the erosion of centralized control. Succession dynamics further complicate the picture. As Khamenei ages, internal competition within the clerical hierarchy and political elite intensifies. Factions vie for influence, creating a volatile environment in which leadership transitions are fraught with uncertainty. Any decision to relocate temporarily could provide time to manage these internal disputes. Yet it simultaneously risks intensifying power struggles. The interplay of succession concerns, domestic unrest, and external pressures represents a complex matrix of threats that the regime must navigate carefully to avoid catastrophic outcomes. Internationally, the implications are significant. Iran's neighbors, regional powers, and global actors are closely monitoring developments, aware that any instability within the country could reverberate across the Middle East. Energy markets, diplomatic alliances, and security calculations are all impacted by perceptions of Iran's stability. The potential relocation of the supreme leader to Russia would not only have domestic consequences, but would also influence regional and global strategic considerations, highlighting the interconnected nature of Iran's crisis with broader international affairs. The human dimension cannot be overlooked. Leaders in precarious positions must weigh personal safety, family security, and political legacy against the imperatives of duty and authority. For Khamenei, the decision to prepare for a potential flight is likely influenced by the complex interplay of threat perception, loyalty, and legacy preservation. Remaining in Iran amidst escalating unrest carries risks of capture, humiliation, or forced abdication, while relocating introduces uncertainties about influence, perception, and long-term political viability. These difficult choices illuminate the high-stakes environment in which authoritarian leaders operate, where every decision carries profound consequences, even if the supreme leader never actually leaves Iran. The existence of contingency plans reflects a shift in the perceived stability of the regime. The discussion alone alters the behavior of elites, security forces, and the public, creating an atmosphere of caution and uncertainty. Authoritarian regimes, in particular, rely heavily on perceptions of strength, confidence, and legitimacy. When these perceptions falter, the system becomes vulnerable to rapid change. In this sense, the preparation for possible relocation is itself an indicator of the regime's precarious position. The convergence of economic crisis, social unrest, factional disputes, succession, uncertainties, and international isolation has created a moment of unprecedented vulnerability for the Islamic Republic. Whether or not Khamenei ultimately flees to Russia, the scenario highlights the extraordinary pressures bearing down on Iran's leadership and the fragility of a system that has long projected an image of permanence. The coming months and years are likely to be defining for the nation, as decisions made at the highest levels will shape the political, economic, and social trajectory of Iran for decades to come. In conclusion, the prospect of the supreme leader fleeing Iran, while speculative, is a powerful lens through which to understand the multiple crises facing the country. Economic collapse, mass protests, internal power struggles, succession uncertainties, and geopolitical vulnerability all intersect to create a precarious environment. Even as the possibility of relocation remains hypothetical, its existence signals the fragility of the regime and the high stakes of leadership in a country undergoing profound change. Iran stands at a crossroads, and the choices made by its leaders will determine not only the future of the Islamic Republic, but also the stability and security of the wider Middle East. As we follow these developments closely, it is crucial to stay informed, analyze carefully, and consider the broader implications of such high-stakes political scenarios. If you found this breakdown insightful and want to keep up with updates, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth analysis of global events and political developments. Your support helps us bring you detailed, accurate, and timely content, so don't miss out on the next updates about Iran and the geopolitical landscape shaping our world.